So thank you for coming along this evening and for organising this meeting. My goal is to do the job of the BBC and tell you what's going on to our health service and by extension most public, well, all public services. We're all on the same trajectory. There aren't many of us out there and this is by no accident. And what I'm hoping to show you with some slides and some video clips is how we ended up being in our current situation and where we will end up if enough of us don't stand up and start actively fighting back and demanding more of our elected representatives. So what I've started off with here is most of us now realise there's a problem with accessing services. I don't know whether any of you have difficulty getting a GP appointment, but the proportion of doctors per head of population in this country has declined. Now that's not an accident. In order to break public trust in the service, to demoralise staff, you have to defund it. You have to make it collapse. You have to destroy its reputation before you can persuade people to give up on what was the best thing that this country's done for its population. So we've seen a stealth privatisation, but this has very, very long roots. In fact, one of the key documents dates back from 1988, authored by Oliver Letwin, called Britain's Biggest Enterprise. And what he set out was some key steps to get us from a public service to an insurance-based service without people noticing. And he set out 5 key things to do: independent trusts, joint ventures, outsourcing, establishing charging, health credits, and an insurance scheme, a private insurance scheme with an element of public funding, but all to be controlled by the private sector. So how did we get here? I'm going to show you a timeline, because it's not just this current government or the coalition government, but unfortunately it has been, the criminal term is joint enterprise over the last 3 decades. And these are the key steps that have occurred. Actually, that's the wrong slide, sorry. That's the private finance initiative slide. I'll come back to that one. There we go. So even predating Letwin's document from 1988, what needed to happen was you needed to repurpose the NHS to change it from a rational system based on general taxation, going through strategic health authorities, and that being divided up between hospitals and GPs. Quite a simple, very effective, very efficient system, run by the professionals on the whole, nurses, experienced doctors, running a rational system. But that's not the way to privatise. You have to replace the medical leadership. And this programme got underway in the 1980s, 1983. Lord Griffiths' report described a general public management ethos. So every public service has been saddled with a bloated senior management structure, which is designed to obediently follow top-down instruction, irrespective of the consequence on staff or the service you're trying to deliver. So that's the key thing, repurposing. The public service ethos, which was to put the patient at the centre of everything you did, had to be replaced by a business ethos. And then you had the setting up of a market. Now apparently we were told if you set up an internal market, this will somehow magically bring in private sector efficiency and everything would be run smoother and everybody would be happy. Now when they talk about private sector efficiency, what they mean is efficiently siphoning money away from the delivery of care. Nothing to do with patient and nothing to do with the professionals. And then you had private finance. How do you separate the public from an asset? Well, the favourite mechanism for doing this is to saddle it with debt. Saddle it with debt which is designed to become unsustainable. Then you paint that public service as a financial basket case, and you come back a few years later on and say, we will use that debt on one hospital A to sell off hospital B, which has no debt. I'll come back to that in a second. And then we had a big leap forward, despite promises by David Cameron of no more top-down reorganisation. In 2012, we had the Health and Social Care Act, which effectively in law abolished the NHS. It removed the duty of the government to provide a health service. Were you aware of this key step?
Yes.
So now it became more postcode lottery in terms of what your clinical commissioning group provides. It's up to their discretion. More services are up to their discretion. Now, what is a clinical commissioning group? Clinical commissioning groups were designed by John Redwood, colleague of Oliver Letwin, formerly of NM Rothschild's privatisation unit, as temporary structures, temporary, self-collapsing, state-funded insurance pools. That's the model. Yeah? Why do that? So the transition from public service to American-run insurance has this intermediate step. You get people conditioned to a certain way of working. You have this internal market separating purchasers, the GPs, through the clinical commissioning groups, and the hospital. You have this completely bogus, wasteful system. But we don't question it anymore. When it first came in, we were saying, well, why do you need this whole tier of management and administrators? Now we all accept it. So stealth is very important. And in 2012, we needed an expert in American healthcare, and we employed a gentleman called Simon Stevens, who actually returned to the NHS as the chief executive from being president of United Health Global Expansion Unit. United Health, America's biggest health insurer, private health insurer, is running the NHS. It's not Jeremy Hunt, it's not Hancock. These are just figureheads. They can only issue one instruction per year to Simon Stevens. They have no day-to-day control of what happens to the NHS. If you listen closely when a politician comes on the TV, they phrase it as the NHS is telling us to do this. Has anybody noticed? The NHS is saying to us, it's arm's length. It's no longer under the control of government. It's under the control of the American insurance guy who's been positioned there. But he returned after helping Tony Blair put in his privatisations. He was advisor to Tony Blair from the late 90s to 2004 when he went off to United Health. Coming back to PFI, let me just recap. You restructure, you remove power from the people with the responsibility, you give it to a management layer, and then you saddle the land with debt. This is PFI. So John Major's idea, instigated by New Labour, we borrowed 11 billion to build new hospitals. Anybody got any idea how much we're paying back? Give us a guess.
30 billion.
30? 88 billion. Now that's not the worst part about this. At the end of the 30 years, we don't own the building. Now would any of you, please come and see me afterwards if you would get one of these deals, would any of you get a mortgage on those conditions, paying back 8 times what you borrowed and not own the asset afterwards? Hopefully none of you would. That's what PFI has been. They have conducted a massive fraud against the public. oddly, the 2008 crash, we bailed out the banks that we've borrowed through the nose, expensive interest rates that were rigged under the LIBOR scandal. So we are paying the villains twice. We've bailed them out and we're also paying through the nose for the debt. Now, despite certain key things had to happen. Before 2006, it's impossible for a publicly run entity to go bankrupt because you are underwritten by the future tax receipts. You can't go bankrupt. So in order to allow hospitals to go bankrupt, they brought in special legislation in 2006 called the Unsustainable Provider Regime. Specific legislation to justify the asset stripping of the NHS. And in 2009, you might have thought people might have had a rethink about neoliberalism, privatisation and everything being handed over to the financial sector. In 2008, you thought, is this really the way to go? No. In 2009, they created the NHS bailiff, the trust special administrator, whose job was to go around to trusts who have been set up to fail by PFI debt and say, well, I'm going to merge you with your neighbour that hasn't got any debt and sell off the neighbouring hospital. Now, this is when I became involved in campaigning and trying to get my head around what's going on. Because we had already suffered the downgrading of my local hospital, Queen Mary's in Sidcup. We lost the A&E, we lost the maternity unit, and my patient care started to suffer. Sick people I'd send them into hospital and they'd come back even sicker than when I sent them in. What's going on here? They were waiting longer to get into outpatients. They were waiting longer at A&E. So you're getting more and more bad reports from patients. And then they threatened to close the A&E of Lewisham Hospital and the maternity unit just down the road, leaving one A&E for 250,000 people. Now, at this point, you start to scratch your head and question, what sort of a democracy are we living in? And that's when I underwent a rapid political maturation. Yeah, I became involved in the Lewisham campaign. I saw how campaign groups work and politics, and did a lot of non-medical reading in terms of health policy, economics, and the dark art of propaganda. Discovered Noam Chomsky and other people who have been great. Now, is PFI unique to this country? Well, no. This is what the World Bank and the IMF have been doing around the world to separate third world countries from their natural resources. You go along to a country, you bribe their leaders, you set up very favourable terms of repayment at the start, which get more and more onerous, then you return a few years later on and you say, you need to restructure, sell off your public assets, give us control of your oil and natural resources, thank you very much. That's exactly what PFI is. In fact, we exported it. It's the City of London that's come up with all these schemes. So, management handed over to entrepreneurial types, separation of responsibility and control, responsibility left with the workforce, control elsewhere, saddling of PFI debt, and then we come to this chap. So he is our current leader of the NHS. Have you heard of Simon Stevens? So you're a very astute group. He should be a household name. He is not a household name. He remains in the shadows. He's wheeled out every now and again. He refuses to take questions that are not submitted in advance. He doesn't do many interviews because he can't lie very well. He's not as practiced. But if you see him he's done a couple of select committees. He's very uncomfortable when he's asked, and he needed to be rescued by Matt Hancock at the last one I saw, where he couldn't answer the MP's question about, are you privatising the NHS with the current GP reforms? This is a quote from 2011, when he was still at United Health. The worldwide need for healthcare in the aging population can drive sales of American insurance. He's the head of the NHS, this chap. In 2012, he was at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, advocating how every Western economy needs to adopt the American HMO model. So what is this HMO model? I'm going to show you a clip now of a scene from Sicko. If you haven't watched Sicko, please watch it. It's a film by Michael Moore. It came out in 2007. When I watched it, when I was completely in the dark about what's going on, I thought, thank God we don't have a system like that over here. Not knowing that we were 3/4 of the way to replicating that system. So I'll just show you that now. Hold on.
Dr. Linda, one person in the healthcare industry who did have a conscience. Dr. Linda Pino, a former medical reviewer at Humana.
My name is Linda Pino. I am here primarily today to make a public confession. In the spring of 1987, as a physician, I denied a man a necessary operation that would have saved his life and thus cost his death. No person and no group has held me accountable for this, because in fact what I did was I saved a company $500,000 for this. And furthermore, this particular act secured my reputation as a good medical director, and it ensured my continued advancement in the healthcare field. I went from making a few $100s a week as a medical reviewer to an escalating six-figure income as a physician executive. In all my work, I had one primary duty, and that was to use my medical expertise for the financial benefit of the organization for which I worked. And I was told repeatedly that I was not denying care, I was simply denying payment. I know how managed care maims and kills patients. So I'm here to tell you about the dirty work of managed care. And I'm haunted by the thousands of pieces of paper in which I have written that deadly word, denied. Thank you.
How did we get to the point that doctors and health insurance companies actually being responsible for the deaths of patients? Who invented this system? How did this all begin? Where did the HMO start? Thanks to the wonders of magnetic tape, we know.
Whether we can include these health maintenance organizations like Edgar Kaiser's terminating thing. Now let me ask you, you know I'm not too keen on these This is a private enterprise. Well, that's a and the reason he can do it, I had Edgar Kaiser come in and talk to me about this, and I went into it someday. All of the incentives are toward less medical care because the less care they give up, the longer they pay. The incentives are on their way.
I am proposing today a new national health strategy. The purpose of this program is simply this. I want America to have the finest health care in the world, and I want every American to be able to have that care when he needs it.
The plan hatched between Nixon and Edgar Kaiser worked. In the ensuing years, patients were given less and less care.
Bigger logjams at the nearby public hospital and less quality medical care.
Been here about 18 hours. Said 7 this morning, 7
What looks cramped and unsightly can also be dangerous.
while the health insurance companies became wealthy. The system was broken.
37 million Americans are without protection against catastrophic illness.
The losers are the poor, who may now postpone urgently needed health care until it's too late.
This went on for years. There was one person in the healthcare industry who did have a conscience. Dr.
So the key phrase, and I hope you picked up on it, is the incentives run the right way. The less care you give them, the more money you make. Did you all pick up on that one quite clearly? Now, the way the NHS worked before it started getting privatised was you aligned the doctor and the patient's incentives. You rewarded good things, cervical screening, immunisation, things that help the patient. You may be incentivised to do more of, and I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. The incentives they're talking about is to align doctors' incomes with the denial of care. This is what the networks are all about. Now that is not a good system. I hope you'd all agree. If my income was dependent on doing harm to you, that is not a good medical system. Anybody disagree with that statement? That's what's going on at the moment. Sometimes it's worth listening from the horse's mouth. So this is going back to Simon Stevens. When he was at United Health, he gave an interview to Forbes magazine. Let's see what he had to say.
Simon Stevens, who is the president of United Health Group's Global Health. United is, of course, the nation's largest health insurance company, and there's a lot of innovation going on in healthcare and health insurance, but one thing is for sure, that employers and our federal government are either unwilling or unable to pay more for healthcare. A lot of belt tightening going on. And you're out there with a new report talking about, which would some would see a radical transformation, moving away from fee-for-service medicine, where physicians do their work, hospitals do the work, and then they get a bill for it. Tell us a little bit about what United is and the industry is talking about doing differently, and how we can save hundreds of billions of dollars.
Point number one is transparency. Point number two is sharing data and changing the way in which doctors and hospitals are paid, so that they are supported in providing care in a way that makes sense for patients. What do I mean by that? I mean that at the moment, for example, most primary care doctors are only paid when a patient goes to visit the office, whereas actually it might make more sense to pay to help keep patients healthy, and that's what this idea of primary care medical homes is all about. So we've been, United Healthcare, testing that model with a number of primary care practices, and the early results are quite promising, showing a 2-to-1 return on investment. The early results are quite promising, showing a 2-to-1 return on investment, and also enabling primary care to do more of the things that primary care ought to be doing.
I'm here with Simon Stevens, who is the president of United Health Group.
So let me translate some of that. He's talking about the American system. The American system is, number one component are the insurers, another component are the private providers. Now the insurers, to maximize profit, they do that by avoiding sick people and denying care. The providers maximize profit by doing things that are unnecessary, double billing, and trying to defraud the insurance company. So how do you get around that when you replicate the HMO model that Nixon was talking about? You bring the provider and the insurer together, and you collaborate against the interest of the patient. And he said in his own words, a 2-to-1 return on investment. So this guy's in charge of the NHS. Now you might think, well, you can't extrapolate what they're doing in the US. This country is entirely different. Let me explain fee-for-service. So again, if you introduce an incentive where the more the doctor does, the more he can charge the insurer, there's a temptation to overdo things and to do things that are unnecessary. That's fee for service. Yeah? You get paid the more you do, right?
Payments by results.
Payments by results. So there was an element of fee for service within the NHS, but the vast majority of your GP income used to come through what's called capitation payment, based on your list size. Yeah? There were some factors for poverty and age and all these other demographic factors were taken into account, but the majority of your income was down to your list size. And there were other things in there which rewarded continuity of care and kept the experienced doctors working. And a doctor would earn his income by seeing patients. Now that has been decoupled. I won't go into that unless somebody wants to ask me later on. But you do not have to see any patient to have a good income as a doctor anymore, with the reforms that took place in 2004. This is the document Simon Stevens was talking about, Farewell to Fee for Service. Simon Stevens, Executive Vice President of United Health Global Expansion, right? A key line in this document, United Health has been operating a successful shared savings program for several years as part of Medicare Advantage Plan. Medicare is taxpayer funded. Shared, who's sharing? The doctor and the insurer. What are they sharing? The money saved from not spending it on the patient. You get it? Yeah? I will have, for example, a quota of hip referrals per year, let's say 5. If somebody else comes along, needs a hip, but my bonus is dependent on not referring him, what am I going to be tempted to do? Not to refer. So this is a complete perversion of the doctor-patient relationship. Well, that's America, nothing to worry about. We're safe. Well, here are 2 recent documents. The NHS long-term plan you may have heard of, and very helpfully the BMA are going along with all of this, the British Medical Association. Investment and evolution. And in the centre there is an extract from the long-term plan. We will offer primary care networks a new shared savings scheme. Sound familiar? Anybody worried about this? Now, what are most GPs told? Most GPs, there's something called behavioural economics, and there's a unit within 10 Downing Street called Behavioural Insights. What is behavioural economics? The use of financial carrots and sticks to shape people's behaviour. Right? So what do, you squeeze funding for 8 or 9 years, you make practices desperate, then you offer some carrots. What they don't realise is if you starve a man for years and you offer him a 3-course meal and you don't tell him it's laced with arsenic, they're going to eat it. Yeah? That's what's happened with the GP primary care network agreement. Most GPs do not have the time or the inclination or the health policy background or the capacity to read the 100, 200-page documents that these are hidden in. And it's deliberately obscured. You have to know what you're reading to make sense of what you're being told. There's lots of talk of efficiency and patient being the centre of everything. The reality is it's all about denial of care. In preparation for takeover by the US. So you introduce perverse incentives and you say to the GP, the only way you're going to get more cash is to join up to a network. That's the only way. Now most GPs who are struggling, they can't retain, staff are leaving, they're going to go for this. What they don't realise is this is a mechanism for capturing the GP's capitation payment. Remember I told you most of the income is dependent on the list size. They have to have a mechanism of getting control of your GP's list. And this is what the evolution is all about. Now at the moment, the BMA and NHS England aren't going to tell any GP, we're grabbing your list. They might be alarmed, right? So they say we're increasing funding. We're providing you opportunities to use different types of staff. Now this is another agenda, it's the de-skilling. So you replace doctors with non-doctors. For the first time ever, you may be presented by your receptionist, not an appointment to see a doctor, but an appointment to see an extended scope physiotherapist, an appointment to see a paramedic, an appointment to see a physician's associate. Now the problem with this tactic is the blind spot. Now for a doctor, before he is let loose as a GP, 5 years studying, 5 years postgraduate experience, and then he becomes a GP. Physician's associate, 2 years. Now you think there might be a problem here? GP will have experience, doesn't know everything, but he'll have a small blind spot. The more you downskill, the greater the blind spot and the bigger the risk for the patient. Let me give you an example. A lady of childbearing age might present with shoulder pain. The receptionist might say, well, that's a good one for the physiotherapist, go and see the physiotherapist. She'll examine the shoulder and say, well, maybe you need to do these exercises. Forgetting to ask about when her last period was. Why? Because she may be having an ectopic pregnancy, which is bleeding, irritating the diaphragm, and giving her referred pain to her shoulder. A potentially catastrophic medical emergency. Do you see? If you dumb things down, you're going to increase the room for error. Why are they doing this? Because you need to cheapen the workforce in preparation for the American takeover. But you've had to create a workforce crisis to justify that. And what GPs don't actually quite realise is they are devaluing their role by accepting non-doctor substitutes to do doctors' work. They're also telling us that IT will come to the rescue. Have you heard of Babylon or GP at Hand or any of these? So these are apps which clearly won't be taken up by everybody. The vast majority of the people who've signed up are under the age of 40. There's a high turnover of people who have signed up who leave after a while because it's such a poor service. But it also sucks out the people who are having least cost on the GP and destabilising neighbouring general practice. Not only that, the algorithms are unsafe. I'll give you one example. A 70-year-old presents with a symptom, and one of the questions is, could you be pregnant? On the algorithm. Now, if anybody, even my 5-year-old child, asked a 70-year-old, could you be pregnant? I'd be a bit embarrassed. And that's the algorithm. And this is what Matt Hancock is backing to the hilt. So something important happened last week, and Donald Trump helped us out, I think.
Ambassador, that the entire economy needs to be on the table in a future trade deal, including the NHS.
I think we're going to have a great trade deal, yes. I think we're going to have a great and very comprehensive trade deal. I think everything with a trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that. But everything will be on the table, absolutely.
It prompted an instant tweet from one of those trying to succeed Theresa May. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, said, "The NHS isn't on the table in trade talks and never will be. Not on my watch."
So it's the job of the UK privatisation lobby to deny until it's all done. And how will it be done? Well, one is to, as I said earlier, to break public faith in the system. The other is to shrink the NHS menu, have companies like McKinsey decide certain treatments aren't effective anymore, and start to chip away at the universality and increase waiting lists so people are driven to either pay out of pocket or take top-up insurance. So there will be a gradual middle-class drift out of the NHS, and you're also having a major shutting down of services, closure of A&E, closure of the unprofitable services, closure of A&E, closure of ITU. We know that for every minute you spend delaying getting to hospital with a serious emergency, that increases your risk of death. So what are the hard endpoints of all of this so far? Well, we know since 2010 there have been 120,000 estimated excess deaths due to cuts in health and social care. We've seen a drop in life expectancy in a Western developed economy, not seen anywhere else in an equivalent economy. And probably more horrifying than anything is, for the first time outside of war, since records began, we're seeing an increase in infant mortality. More children are dying because of all the cuts and closures. Now, infant mortality is a very sensitive measure of how good your health system is, because it's amenable to healthcare. A lot of the deaths are preventable if you have the services in place. So there are real effects that are being felt up and down the country, and the current push is to dismantle general practice, and dismantle general practice by the creation of networks, perverse incentives, replacing GPs with non-doctors, and there are legislative changes that are going through, which have sneaked through. Now, you were all paying attention, and I'm sure you noticed that in February, secondary legislation was passed. You all noticed that, yeah? It was reported widely on the news, wasn't it? Or is that just me? Secondary legislation means you can avoid a discussion in Parliament, you can change the law, and what they have done here is created a new legal entity to hold the budgets called an integrated care provider. Now, forgive the acronym, but this is deliberately, they keep changing the names, so as soon as we get used to one name, we switch to something else. HMO, ACO, ACS, ICP, they are all the same. It's a mechanism for the insurers to grab the budgets. Now, Labour did make an attempt to have a prayer motion to cause this to be debated in Parliament. They lost. So you have behind the scenes legal changes. You've got this contract that the GPs have been conned by their own union into signing up to without any debate, with great speed, before our own annual meeting, which is due to be held at the end of the month, and being told there is no alternative. Yeah? This was the outcome of that prayer motion. And the final thing is, now there's something quite perverse, you might think this is a bit odd, but there's something within the Health and Social Care Act 2012 which, if things are going out to tender, it makes it open to public scrutiny. It's called Section 75. Section 75 makes sure that any contract that's put out can be scrutinised. Now, that's not a good thing if you want to set up a HMO, because a HMO needs the ability to have a private sector monopoly within the NHS. So the final thing they need to achieve is actually to get people to call for the scrapping of Section 75. Now, who's calling for a scrapping of Section 75? This is very worrying. The GMB Union, the National Campaign Group, Keep Our NHS Public, We Own It, and a think tank, supposedly in the public interest. So, now either this is incompetence or it's complicity. Take your pick. But it's not a good idea, because Simon Stevens is calling for the repeal of Section 75. If my enemy is calling for a particular action, I would be deeply suspicious and look very closely at it. But this is being presented as, oh, he thinks privatisation, we've gone too far, we need to pull back. But it's a trick. This is a bit I don't want you to show. So United Health have a wholly owned subsidiary, and this wholly owned subsidiary is called Optum. They are behind the scenes. They're they're enmeshed in the financial mechanisms of the NHS, and we've researched where they hold contracts in the country, and this is the map. So that's United Health's footprint across the country that we know of. Either they're involved in decision support software, they're involved in referral management centres, or they are helping to implement these reforms, the networks and all the rest of it. So that's where they are.
All the orange bits.
All the orange bits, yeah. So, this is not some hypothetical scenario. We are nearly there. There's a national emergency, that's not. There's a national emergency in terms of raising public awareness. Don't wait for the BBC and ITV to tell you any of this, because they are actively blocking. People like myself have been censored. During the junior doctor dispute, there was the Victoria Derbyshire show. I managed to get on. What they do is they pre-interview you before they give you the mic. They ask you, what are you going to say? And people who said, well, we want to link the junior doctor dispute to privatisation and downskilling, didn't get on. I luckily didn't say that. I got on, and it got a significant response from the audience. Now, any proper journalist might want to follow that up, because it was quite controversial what I said. I said this is deliberate, it's driving doctors out of the system, and they want to drop the wage bill. And don't you think a journalist should follow that up? But they listened and didn't follow it up. On ITV, so the BBC, their senior executives are handpicked. They're political appointees, really. ITV has a huge commercial interest in advertising private healthcare. Vitality Healthcare, anybody? Sausage Dog? Jessica Ennis? Is it just me who's a bit sad spotting all this stuff? Please look out for it, it's everywhere. They sponsor Premiership football matches. Any free magazine, if you look on the bar of when you're next Googling, Vitality, pink sign, Sausage Dog. It's everywhere. You've got blanket advertising for health insurance. That's what Vitality are. My guess is Vitality will suck people in before they sell out to United Health or another American operation. So that's where we are, and the reason I'm here is not because I think it's all over. I think if we can break the lack of public awareness, we have a chance. And all of you are now better informed than most people who work in the health service. And it's over to you. Thank you.